chair there, and the clerk will swear you in, please.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. Sir, would you introduce yourself to the board and spell your name for our reporter, please?
Neal Sedgwick, first name's Neal, last name Sedgwick.
And sir, how long have you been with the Columbia Police Department?
3 years,
You're still with the PD?
yes.
What's your position right now?
Police officer,
In patrol?
patrol,
Have you always been in patrol?
yes.
And so 3 years, that put you starting at what, about 2010?
Yeah, October of 2010.
And so, just very briefly describe for us what your training was coming into the PD.
I attended the Eastern Jackson County Regional Police Academy in Independence. It was 855-hour academy. And then I worked 2 years in the County Sheriff's Department prior to that.
Okay,
Or
so
after that, prior year.
You had a couple of years of law enforcement experience prior to coming to CPD.
Yes,
And did you have use of force training in the academy?
yes,
Did you have it at the Boone County Sheriff's Department?
yes,
And did you have it at the Columbia Police Department?
yes.
So do you have a recollection of the events of the night of August 15, 2011?
I do.
What is it about that night that you recollect? Why do you recollect that night?
That was the night we took Kenneth Baker into custody for a warrant.
And can you just generally describe for us how you came to be at Mr. Baker's residence?
I responded to Assistant Officer Casper. We were dispatched there for a warrant call. The gentleman, the residents had called and said Kenneth Baker was at his residence and believed he had an active warrant for his arrest.
And you went over there?
Yes,
And I think you guys actually parked a little farther away than you intended, is that
I
right?
did.
And so the body mics didn't actually activate. But you entered the house, and before too long you were engaged with a pretty vicious struggle with Mr. Baker, correct?
Yes,
It was a fight, wasn't it?
yeah,
And it went on for over 2 minutes, didn't it?
it did.
And what do you remember about that fight?
Just the violence of the fight was, it was probably the most violent, prolonged violent fight I've been in that went on as long as it did.
You've been in a few fights?
Yeah.
Describe for us what you remember happening during that fight. What did Mr. Baker do, and what did you do in response?
Well, when he initially pulled away, we took him down to the couch, with both of us positioned over him. And I wear a lapel mic that comes up, and I have a ring that hooks through my button loop, so I hook it on there so that you can't pull it, it won't come loose. He reached up and wrapped his right hand around my lapel, the cord, and was pulling me down towards him with his right hand. With his left hand, he was grabbing at Officer Casper, and eventually got a hold of his gun belt and was able to get it loose. At the same time, his whole body was just tensed and trying to come up off the couch and scream, and it's pretty violent.
And were you pretty violent in return?
I was.
So how did you finally get him under control?
We eventually were able to roll him off the couch. All of us kind of fell into a pile on the floor. And he landed on his stomach with his hands under him. And at that time, we were eventually just able to get his hands from behind him, from under him, and get him handcuffed.
At some point, did you deploy pepper spray against him?
I did.
And what happened?
It had very little effect. When I initially sprayed him, he was actually spitting it out and clenched his teeth and was like growling and cussing and challenging us more. Come on, and like it didn't have the effect that it typically would have that when I've sprayed it in the past on people.
Okay. And eventually, though, you were able to get him over and get the cuffs on, correct? And by that point, you were exhausted?
Yes.
And Casper was exhausted?
Yes.
You were visibly exhausted, yeah?
Yes.
So as you're getting him in custody, does Officer Kreitz arrive?
We got him in custody. We kind of stayed on the floor a little bit to catch our breaths, gather ourselves. got him to his feet, as we started walking to the door, the front door, that's when Officer Kreitz was coming through the front door.
And he assisted you with getting Mr. Baker out of the house?
Yeah,
And in fact, you turned over custody of Mr. Baker at that point to Officer Kreitz because you and Casper were so exhausted.
yes.
And Casper's gun belt was hanging down.
It was dangling down, and his, I think his mic pack, and I know his magazine pouch had fell off, was laying on the floor.
And so you went outside with Mr. Baker and Officer Casper and Officer Kreitz. And do you recall who else was there at that point?
I remember seeing Sergeant Bruce Houston and Officer Rob Sanders shortly right after that. I think Sergeant Buck was there sometime after that.
And you and Officer Casper had some work to still do there at the house, and so Mr. Baker was transported by Officer Kreitz, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that's after there was a struggle just to get Mr. Baker searched at the rear of a patrol car, is that right?
Yeah, we walked into the rear of Officer Kreitz's patrol car, and he was trying to do a pat-down search before he put him in the car, and asked him to lay over the car, and he started to raise up, and started to turn, and start to fight again. So he had to, I think Officer Kreitz had to use a wrist lock on him to get him to comply long enough to do the pat-down search.
Did you get a chance to observe the wrist lock?
Yeah, I mean, I was standing right there, I don't remember exactly.
Did you have the impression that Officer Kreitz was cranking pretty hard?
Yeah.
And this Mr. Baker wasn't feeling it, was he?
It didn't hurt me. I mean, it was, you know, he had to put it on for a little bit before he finally complied.
And all this occurs in the presence of Officer Sanders.
Yes.
So at some point then, did you make it over to the PD?
We did.
And what did you do when you got to the police department?
We parked in the garage, came through the side door there, past the front desk, and then made our way back to the booking room.
And what did you find in the booking room?
Officer Sanders and I believe it was Officer Kreitz and Hitler had walked into the booking area. As we were coming down the hall, they were coming into the booking area. We kind of all met at once in there.
And what did you learn at that point?
That he had resisted in the holding cell, and that I think somebody said they called medics, but I'm not sure.
Did you hear Officer Sanders make any comments?
I remember him talking to Officer Casper.
Okay. Did you hear anything about losing round 2?
I remember hearing something about it.
Okay. Did that strike you as any, there was any malice in that statement from Officer Sanders?
No.
Did it strike you as unusual that a cop might say something sarcastic?
No.
Have you ever said anything sarcastic?
Yeah.
Do you find it common for officers to joke and be sarcastic after high-stress situations?
It's pretty typical.
And it's certainly not an indicator of a retaliatory intent, is it? Did you have the impression that Officer Sanders pushed Mr. Baker in the holding cell because he was retaliating against Mr. Baker for what happened out at the house?
No.
Now, you are familiar with the rings at the back of holding cells, yes?
Yes.
And in your training and experience with the Columbia Police Department, you understood it to be the custom and the practice of the department that if somebody was banging on the cell door, regardless of anything else, if they're banging on the cell door, they're going to get handcuffed to the ring, yes?
Yes.
Okay. And you understood it was the custom and practice of the police department that if that person refused to comply with a request to sit down cooperatively, that force was going to be used against them to do it, right?
Yes.
And there was no waiting around, there was no ignoring them. It was the expectation of your superiors that if that occurred, you went in and you put them on the ring, right?
Yes.
And you didn't wait for the SWAT team, and you didn't call for 5 more cops, right?
No.
You had who you had, and you went in and you put them on the ring.
Yes.
And that's what your FTO taught you, yes?
Yes.
That's what your sergeant taught you.
Yes.
Okay, that's what your chain of command taught you.
Yes.
And that's what was expected of you as a police officer in the Columbia Police Department.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, if they resisted in the holding cell, if they caused any kind of disturbance in the holding cell, we put them on the ring.
If they're banging on the door, they go on the ring.
That's right.
Period.
Yes.
Thank you. No questions.
Russ,
No question.
anything else, Mr. Jansen?
I'm sorry, let me come back. Have you ever put anybody on the ring?
Wait a minute. We're done.
I,
He doesn't get to come back.
Well, maybe another question, you didn't want to cross.
No, he doesn't get to come back.
that's all right.
It's all right, we'll ask
He
you a
has
question
not.
for him. Oh, that's kind of simple. Have you ever put anybody on the holding ring?
I have not.
Okay. You said you were trained to do it.
We didn't have formal training to do it, but we were told that was the policy to put them on the ring if they cause disturbance in the holding cell.
What kind of disturbance?
Banging on the door, yelling, screaming.
So any disturbance at all, if somebody goes on the ring, because they're yelling, that's reason enough to put them on the ring.
At the time, yeah.
Okay. And how do you put somebody on the ring?
Well, first you would ask them to comply and sit down so you could be put on the ring and tell them that your intent was to put them on the ring. If they didn't comply, then you went into the cell and you used whatever force you needed to use. to put them on.
Whatever force, no matter what it took.
I guess it would depend on, the amount of force you would use would dictate what they were doing, I guess.
So, in what you think has been your training, because you never had to do it, would you push somebody like, you've probably seen the video, we all have, would you push somebody like Officer Sanders did?
Would I push anybody like Officer Sanders, or would I push Kenneth Baker like Officer Sanders did? It depends. If I'd have entered the holding cell knowing what Officer Sanders did about Kenneth Baker and what he had done prior to coming in there, and what he was doing in the holding cell at the time, I would have pushed him like Officer Sanders.
What was he doing at the holding cell at the time, do you know?
At the time, I didn't know. I do know now.
What was he doing?
Beating on the door, yelling.
How do you know that?
I've seen the video.
It was suggested probably a better way to put him on the ring was for two officers to go in there and get one each arm and put it down. That seemed like a better plan to you based on experience, training you had?
For Kenneth Baker, no. Because I know what he did on scene with two officers.
Was he not
And we were in
exhausted
the
as you
final,
were?
what's that?
Was he as exhausted as you were after this tussle?
I don't know.
Because you guys were wore out, and the two of you, I think you might have been wore out.
Well, he was in better shape than I am, so I doubt he was exhausted as I was.
Any other questions of the officer? Art?
In your direct testimony, you stated that when you went into the booking room, you had heard that Baker had, quote, resisted in the holding cell.
Yes.
So you heard he resisted in the holding
I
cell.
don't know the exact wording, but he had caused some sort of disturbance in the holding cell.
Is banging on the door resistance? I'm trying to get what you meant by you heard that he had resisted.
I heard he had caused a disturbance in the holding cell.
Okay, so you're taking away the word resisted.
He resisted by not complying with their orders.
Okay.
He resisted by not complying with Officer Sanders' orders.
Okay,
That's a level of resistance.
okay. I understand now, thanks.
Anyone else? Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Next witness?
Rob Sanders.